Good afternoon and welcome to the Rumi Forum Luncheon Series. We're very honored to have Joseph Montville here today with us. Joe is director of the Abrahamic Family Reunion, the Esalen Institute project to promote Muslim, Christian, Jewish reconciliation. He also is senior advisor on interfaith relations at the Washington National Cathedral and has appointments at American and George Mason universities. Joe founded the Preventative Diplomacy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 1994 and directed it until 2003. Before that, he spent 23 years as a diplomat with posts in the Middle East and North Africa. He also worked in the State Department's bureaus for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs and Intelligence Research, where he was the chief of the Near East Division and director of the Office of Global Issues. Joe has held faculty appointments at the Harvard and University of Virginia medical schools. He defined the concept of Track 2 diplomacy, non-official diplomacy. Educated at Lehigh, Harvard, and Columbia Universities, Joe is the editor of Conflict and Peacemaking in Multi-Ethnic Societies and editor of the Psychodynamics of International Relationships. In 2008, the International Society of Political Psychology gave Montville its Nevitt Sanford Award for Distinguished Professional Contribution to Political Psychology at its 31st annual scientific meeting in Paris. And Joe is here to speak with us about the Abrahamic Family Reunion. I'm very happy to have him with us today in Track 2 Diplomacy, which he has founded. So, thank you, Joe.
Pleasure to be here. Are you going to start with questions?
Why don't we start with...
well, we talked a little bit about a little background. How did I get, how did a nice guy like me end up in a place like this? My career in the Foreign Service had a profound influence on my my activity, my thoughts, and my future. I studied Arabic, and I served in Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, and Morocco. And I had a year in Egypt as a Fulbrighter, so I have a lot of immersion in the Arab and Muslim world. But I also focused a great deal on the diplomacy, the formal Track 1 diplomacy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the peace processes, and came to see what the limits are in formal diplomacy, that states, they like to make deals. We send out diplomats to try to make deals. George Mitchell is the latest deal maker sent out. But there is a tremendous amount of frustration in the struggles to help Israelis and Palestinians, Arabs and Jews, and to make peace. So the concept of Track 2 diplomacy came to me out at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, which is not a traditional research institute, but it's a wonderful place for creative thinking. And I was there working on the psychology of the US-Soviet relationship then, because I became a political psychologist halfway through my diplomatic career, 2/3 of the way through my diplomatic career. Because we had to understand what motivates and nurtures the continuation of ethnic and sectarian conflict and violence. And traditional diplomacy and negotiating training and mediation training is not the answer to what I came to believe is the necessity for healing the wounds of history, which is not very hard-headed Washington approach towards problem solving. When you can launch, fighter planes, healing history seems to take so much longer. But that's really what our challenge is. So that's, plus I lost a lot of colleagues in the Foreign Service. And so the fact that one of the things we did in the Near East Bureau most efficiently in the 70s and 80s was to charter buses to take us up to the Washington National Cathedral for memorial services for our fallen colleagues. So, so there's a lot of motivation there to help save some lives, innocent Israeli lives, innocent Palestinian lives, and innocent Foreign Service lives, because we do our business without arms. And at least we haven't, maybe in Iraq there's arms. But anyway, we need a whole new dimension of understanding history, defining it, identifying the tasks of healing that need to be undertaken, and then to start processes to heal. And that's how I ended up doing this Abrahamic Family Reunion project.
I think I understand in terms of trying to figure out where people are coming from as a means to try and understand where people are coming from, to try and figure out why they do what they do, why it gets to that point. I had a professor once tell me nothing is frozen in time. Yeah. It has a history, and not in terms of justifying maybe a heinous act, of course, but to understand it so it doesn't happen again. And I think that, or that it doesn't happen as often as it does. And
yeah.
I think this is very important.
Yeah. Well, part of the task as it's evolved in the Abrahamic Family Reunion project is to literally walk through history, to take a history, like the way a physician takes a history of a pathology, to understand where there were invasions or traumas that occurred that took reasonably healthy relationships and put them in a path of defensiveness, fear, right. Loathing, a very limited capacity to understand and trust another, an enemy. And literally, history is the story of aggression and violence of one tribe and nation against the other. This project focuses on the history of the interaction between the Jews, the Roman Empire, the evolution of Christendom out of Palestine, the founding of Islam in the 7th century, and the interaction of Muslims and Jews and Christians throughout history. And there's a fascinating and tragic history, a creative history, and all of that cries out to be recovered to establish the human and humanistic basis for respectful engagement and relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
So once the history is understood and brought out into the open, how is it, I would suppose through projects, through the mission, the purpose of the Abrahamic Family Reunion, how does that play out? Yeah.
Well, the methodology, the approach is a cognitive one, like cognitive psychology. This is information that most people aren't aware of. That if we become aware of it, we can consider or reconsider our attitudes towards the other, whatever tradition we belong to. I believe that most healthy human beings have, by definition, all healthy human beings have an internalized sense of right and wrong. Mm-hmm. It's something, our moral development is part of our human psychological development. So, for instance, one of the things I've been looking at and building a library on is how the language in the Gospel of John, where the author or authors of that Gospel put into Jesus' mouth the words, "You Jews are of your father, the devil." That turned out to be one of the worst phrases ever put to parchment, because it contributed to a basis for a demonization of the Jews as a people, in perpetuity, as the deicides, the killers of Christ. And one of the most important authors to document this history of the Christian-Jewish relationship and how dogma evolved in the early church and became institutionalized in European Christendom is James Carroll, a novelist, an essayist, journalist, a prophet in his own right, former priest, a person of passionate moral conviction. And
Constantine's Sword.
The author of Constantine's Sword, which is very much a story of his personal journey, but how he became appalled as he went through the history of the Christian-Jewish relationship. And how literally it wasn't until 1965, long after the Gospel of John was written and recorded and translated, that the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Vatican II Council formally absolve the Jewish people from its charge of perpetual collective guilt for the crucifixion of Christ. That's a long time to get the record straight. And even then, it wasn't a resounding mea culpa on the part of the Church. So, and then Jim Carroll made a documentary, Constantine's Sword, and it starts with interviews of Catholics on the sidewalk in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, quite cheerfully. I mean, they were full of vindictiveness, saying, yes, the Jews killed Christ. That's what we were taught, the Jews killed Christ. And this is after the tremendous effort to get the language in Vatican II, the Nostra Aetate document, absolving the Jews, or saying that simply it was a bum rap in the first place. And many of the Jews and Christians that have been working on getting this story straight felt that, and they blame that on Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, pushing back so much of a struggle to get history. So it's an ongoing struggle. The good news is there is a growing number of interfaith dialogue groups that really want to get history right, and and especially very gratifying number of Muslim and Jewish initiatives on the part of young American Muslims and Jews, and middle-aged professionals, and older people too, who simply don't accept the received wisdom or fear and loathing that there is a permanent enmity. But of course, it's all complicated by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that sets a whole new set of emotions, memories, fear, and tragic trauma also, which is very current.
So how does Track 2 diplomacy fit into all of this?
Yeah, well, Track 2 diplomacy, it's a term that came to me on 5 minutes' notice when I was asked to explain why I was at Esalen Institute in 1980 at a big meeting. And I couldn't simply say, I love hot sulfur springs and hot tubs, and being on a gorgeous cliff surrounded by flowers overlooking the Pacific. That wasn't serious, because I was actually taking official time for my State Department job. It was actually launched a very, very effective movement of what also is called citizen diplomacy. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Carter administration cut off cultural relationships, exchanges. They didn't know what else to do. We didn't reach for our bombers right away, but we did do some other things to make it uncomfortable for the Soviets to stay there. But we're very conscious of the incredible amount of nuclear weaponry aimed at each other. And so there was really a survival instinct on the part of people who were used to being unconventional, to take some initiatives. And so I said, when I was asked what am I doing there, I said, I suppose you could say what you're doing. They were visiting the Soviet Union, going to conferences on psychology and things like that. What you're doing is Track 2 diplomacy. What I do is Track 1 official. And what happened was that Track 2 became a very convenient phrase to encapsulate all of the instinct of citizens who wanted to do something, not just stand by and waiting for the nuclear holocaust to take place. And coming from somebody in the State Department, it gave a sanction. It was totally unauthorized by the official Track 1 establishment to go forth and multiply and do, and boy, they did. There were so many new organizations and initiatives set up to go to the Soviet Union and establish people-to-people contacts.
Ambassador McDonald?
John McDonald, yeah.
Yes, yes, he has a...
He was one of my students. He's older than I am.
Yeah,
But,
okay, yes.
but we were colleagues together in the
Right.
Foreign Service Institute.
Right.
And he has the same instincts about human engagement. So he did a lot. He formed his own organization, the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. So what the concept did was just give a license to people who had the instinct to engage with the other, with the enemy, and to transform enemy relationships into ones of reasonable coexistence and friendship where possible.
And those in the Track 1 diplomacy department couldn't really engage with, in the way that they couldn't maybe.
There simply was not traditionally in the conceptual toolbox of formal diplomacy. Mm-hmm. Formal diplomacy involves the mobilization or the utilization by states, by governments, of what assets they have. Mm-hmm. Some people use persuasion. The Swiss use convening capacity in neutral spaces. The superpowers tend to use the implied threat of economic coercion, political coercion, or in the last resort, and for some people in the first resort, military coercion. Track 2 works to mobilize all kinds of other human potentials for engagement and problem solving. And it's based on an understanding that when people have been traumatized in their history, and they develop a victimhood psychology, and it's very hard for them to experiment with new relationships. They need to be persuaded that the perpetrator, the side, the country, the nation, the tribe that has hurt them in the past is ready for a new relationship. And that takes very well facilitated communication and dialogue with sensitive third parties. That's what, and this Abrahamic Family Reunion project takes a portion of the tasks of Track 2 diplomacy, which I defined in an article once, called, it's trying to create an environment in public opinion that makes it safe for political leaders to take risks for peace. Harold Saunders, a very close colleague of a former Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East in South Asia, keeps emphasizing that governments don't make peace, people make peace, and this is working on the people side.
Yes, absolutely. All right, with that, let's open up to our audience for questions. When you get the microphone, most of you know this already, but please stand up, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then try and speak as clearly as possible into the microphone. And I'm going to go with Tom first, in the back, and then Cynthia.
My name is Tom Block, and I am a nascent Track 2 diplomat, self-designated. And I've worked with Joe on his Abrahamic Family Reunion project. And in this work, Joe, as I get started, I'm always concerned that I don't see the connection between the two tracks. Because certainly living in Washington, I have many friends who work on Capitol Hill and whatnot, and they look at the work I personally do in terms of the outreach and the arts and cultural relationships across these religious divides as, cute, but not necessarily relevant to what they're doing, which is, like you said, getting ready to figure out who gets Bahamas. So I was wondering how you see, having been in both worlds, how you see this connection being bridged.
Well, that's the core question. How do we make a difference? I will say that from the time that Track 2 became appeared in literature, I did an article for Foreign Policy in 1981 and introduced the concept there, and some very senior career Foreign Service officers, supervisors of mine, were not excited about the concept. They tend to wrinkle their nose when they hear it. The idea that unofficial people could make a contribution to the diplomatic process was territorial. They were, it was getting to their space. It took a while for diplomats career diplomats and foreign policy specialists to see that there was a role to play. Maybe 10, 12 years ago, there was a meeting in the Loy Henderson conference room in the State Department where an Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the highest ranking political or a career appointment, keynoted a conference on the engagement of Track 2 and Track 1 diplomacy. And he pronounced it as part of the conceptual framework now for the State Department. But then he retired. And now I'll say that this track 2 diplomacy is, it's in the air. It's a lot of academic study programs, and it's understood. But what the struggle is between the instinct towards sort of aggressive or a more militant form of diplomacy and an inclination towards a more humane human engagement form of interaction. And what we need to do is balance a mix. States cannot just simply engage. President Obama took a lot of flack for saying he was willing to engage. And it was such a contrast to the Bush-Cheney administration, which didn't particularly like foreigners anyway. So what we need to do is find a way to develop and advance a policy of respectful engagement. Right now we're doing it with the Iranians on the nuclear fuel enrichment issue, but we're getting closer and closer. And I think Obama's speech in Cairo, his gestures towards expressing respect towards the Muslim world, which in addition to feeding the suspicions of some very right-wing people in this country that he's actually a covert Muslim waiting to take over the country, sent a message of respect to the Muslim world from the predominantly Christian United States. That in itself created an environment. Gestures of respect are so important in diplomatic relations and international relationships. And I think that there has been, even as the Iranian nation and the political culture is very, very, very divided now. And only Iranians can work out how they're going to govern themselves and who can legitimately govern, and that's a struggle underway. They still have a formal diplomacy, and I think that there's been relative responsiveness on the nuclear fuel issue. We'll wait to see how the negotiations are going up, because we're willing to engage with them, and we have sent these. And they knew that they had to get off the limb on the tree that they put themselves. That there has been some payoff for that. So it's an internal, constant struggle. And my Abrahamic Family Reunion project, which you're very intimately involved, could be seen as the most indirect kind of way of transforming Muslim-Christian-Jewish relationships. But I think it's fundamental to establishing the legitimacy of the concept. So the idea of the Abrahamic family, for one thing, and then the family reunion for another thing, I chose very deliberately to symbolize a hunger for people who are estranged and afraid of each other to want to get together on a human basis and to feel safe again. So the painting you did, which is our signature painting that comes up on our website, and I want everybody watching and listening to memorize Abrahamic Family Reunion, all one word, abrahamicfamilyreunion.org. It's very rich with educational materials and information, graphics, and Tom's painting of the Abrahamic Family Reunion is a very important part of it, because it's a picture of Sarah, Abraham's wife, who was infertile for such a long time, Abraham himself, Isaac, the only son of Abraham and Sarah, well, the first son of Abraham and Sarah. After that, she started having babies. And then Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham and Hagar, who was a servant in the household, an Egyptian slave. So the whole family's there together. And it's deliberately designed to appeal to the emotional needs that all of us have for who have been alienated by any family members or any other close people, to want to reconcile, to get together, to heal. And since the book of Genesis, which is very controversial and much of the literal interpretation of it, does have the story of Isaac joining, Ishmael joining Isaac to bury their father in Hebron, the cave of Machpelah. It has a powerful instinct, and And political psychology and large group psychology teaches us that all human beings have a hunger to feel safe, protected, appreciated, and loved. And so while George Mitchell is doing his thing against terrible, very tough working conditions, I'm trying to do to give legitimacy to the idea that we are a family. And again, it's like track 2 diplomacy. If you give a conceptual hook to hang a human instinct to make things better on, and my project works with NGOs in the Bay Area, Greater Los Angeles, and Boston, were the 3 of the most active areas, but also in New York and in Washington. Rabbis and imams are getting together. And so my idea is, I'm also working with theology schools, the Boston Theological Institute, and an umbrella group for 9 schools of theology, Harvard Divinity School, 2 at Boston University, Boston College. Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley has several schools. The idea is to teach students of theology and professors that theology isn't theology anymore. Theology is political. And history is the history of how theology has been shaped by political needs of political actors. I've come to believe that as soon as the prophets die, whether the Hebrew prophets who were positive, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Jesus, the prophet Muhammad, as soon as the prophets die, the politicians take over in their struggles to survive. I mean, Emperor Constantine is my favorite example, where he decided that Christendom was good for the Roman Empire, and so he issued a decree that all religions will be allowed to flourish, but Christendom had the favor. It was just scary to the Christians because up to that time the Romans were just trying to kill them all the time, make life miserable. So Constantine is the great hero of Christendom, of spreading Christendom throughout the Roman Empire. But he's also the guy that murdered his wife and two sons for political reasons. So it's a mixed message, and history and the history of religion. And I even mentioned Urban II, who created called for the First Crusade in 1095 in a field in France. Clerics, peasants, bourgeoisie go to Jerusalem and take Jerusalem back from the Saracens, the birthplace of Bethlehem, the birthplace of our Savior. The Saracens, the Muslims, are slaughtering women and children. Go save Christendom from these savages. And the Christians who got excited about that, and this was basically a political ploy on the part of the Pope to distract Christians in Europe from their internecine warfare that was making it life impossible in Europe, which is the European tradition, and get them to go, fight somebody else. On the way, along the Rhine River, the Christians stopped off and killed an estimated 1/3 of the Jewish population of Europe in the villages because they'd killed Jesus. This sort of a warm-up. The rock concert, you have warm-up bands, and then you have the main event. The main event was Jerusalem, where the great slaughter of Jews and Muslims took place in the name of Jesus. But on the way, they killed a lot of Jews because the Jews had killed Christ. That is the sordid part of our interfaith history. And we all have to be aware of it, so we know that when we look at theology, we have to define for ourselves what is the most important part of theology. And in researching sacred literature in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I have a bias. I like the prophets who say a good society is a society that cares for the least among us, that cares for the widows and orphans, that loves God, loves the neighbor, and respects the stranger. That is Abrahamic theology as far as I'm concerned, and it's consistent. Muhammad the prophet embraced these values. Jesus amplified these values that he learned from the Hebrew prophets. But politics and human nature and political structures and the competition for power or the defense of leaders against those who challenge them for power, and very often the defense is preemptive kidnapping and murder, have distorted theology. And there's always a priest or an imam, a judge, or a rabbi who can find a way to justify what a political leader needs to justify violence. So the human struggle is to find out a way to recognize that most people crave a connectedness to some higher power, some sort of supreme being, and we're all hungry for a sense of safety, respect. We crave respect, recognition, acceptance, and respect. Call that the iron laws of human nature once in an Irish peace meeting. So that is our struggle. I think we know enough about human motivation now that it shouldn't be mystifying anymore. And what we need is to develop standards for our political leadership that limit their instinct to use violence or dishonesty or corruption, and also our economic actors too, to keep them following rules and ethical rules that serve the better interests of society. So it's a big job, but somebody's got to do it.
Cynthia. Yes.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Butler. I am was on the board of advisors of a fledgling NGO called Conflict Solutions International. So it's probably aspiring to. We should probably learn more about you and figure out how we can help you and vice versa. But my question.
Abrahamic Family Reunion.org.
Got it down. Okay, thanks. I have a question and a comment. One, there's a Holy Land Ecumenical Foundation conference that everybody's invited to, obviously, this weekend coming up at the JP2 Center. If you don't know about that already, everyone's encouraged to go to that. That addresses what's going on with the Christians, particularly in Palestine. The question I had was, is it sufficient to just sort of get history right when there's so much history? I mean, you sort of said the path. I'm wondering about the path to peace here, because if we just get history correct in terms of what happened, it would tend to open and reopen wounds, I would think.
Good point. Yeah.
So is it more than just getting it correct? Is it sort of figuring out a way to make it go toward a higher place of progress?
Right. No, I'm glad you asked that. And I did mention earlier the idea of healing history. The healing part is the hardest part. The first part, in a way, researchers can get the history right. But what we have to do, the peacemakers, both official and unofficial, have to support a process of healing history. I believe very strongly that getting history right is the acknowledgement, where each side, and all sides are guilty at some point in history or contemporary times, of hurting the other side, of committing aggression, of traumatizing, even war crimes. And the important part in the healing process is for the perpetrators or the descendants of the perpetrators. Think in terms of nations, states, to acknowledge wrongdoing, but it could be institutions. John Paul II, Pope, spent a lot of time towards the end of his life and acknowledging the crimes of certain Christians against certain groups, Eastern Orthodox, women, Muslims, Jews. He was very, very moved by his sense, his knowledge of how Christians had harmed Jews in Europe. So acknowledgement and contrition are critical. And that's those two steps are critical to transforming relationships. How to do it for mass public opinion. How to get politicians to recognize that this is a critical role to transforming relationships. Now, on the first page of our website, AbrahamicFamilyReunion.org, there are two pictures, stills, taken from videos that you can click on and watch right on your computer screen. One is of the late Christer Stendahl, former dean of the Harvard Divinity School, former Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm, Rabbi Mark Gopin, one of the previous stars of the Rumi Forum and professor of world religion, diplomacy, and conflict resolution at George Mason, and Abdelaziz Sachedina, whose latest book was just published, Islam and the Challenge of Human Rights. which was characterized by a professor of Jewish studies at Toronto. He is characterized as the leading Islamist thinker in the world, writing in English in the world. He's also a very close friend of mine. So that's one side. And each speaks about what Abraham means to me from a spiritual, theological perspective. And not only are they tremendously informed and wise, but they also convey a sense of real affection. This was toward the end of a 2-week residency that the William and Mary Grief Foundation through John Kaiser had, who's also been on this show, funded, where they could just engage. So that's one side of the issue. How can Muslims, Christians, and Jews really listen and learn from each other and learn to care for each other? Well, here are living examples of 3 scholars, theologians who've done it. Then on the other picture is a still from Australia. The culmination of a project done in Australia, and some followers of initiatives of change for many years had been putting the case for an official Australian apology to the Aboriginal people, especially the families of what they called the stolen generation, children of Australians of brilliant Nordic, Scots-Irish fathers whose bodies were filled with love and produced children with Aboriginal women. So they were half Aboriginal, half white. They were, as a matter of state policy, federal government policy, taken away from their families to be raised in schools as noble Europeanized Christians, so they wouldn't be savage like their mothers. The film opens, the documentary is a tremendously effective documentary, with a scene from the children in their dormitory schools, really cute, and an Anglo official saying, we have to take these children away from their mothers and raise them so they'll be civilized like us. And the mothers will cry, scream at the beginning, but soon they'll forget it because they don't think about their children that much. So in a sense, it's one of the most beautiful phrases of sheer racist viciousness that one could hear. Because all you have to do is imagine your own child being taken away by an agent of the state, never to be seen again. So then the film goes on to this process of modern Australians and Aborigines working together to work up to what became one of the most moving examples I've ever seen, probably the single most moving example of a state in the form of a newly elected Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, formally engaging in a process of acknowledgement and contrition, and asking forgiveness of the Aboriginal people, the parents and the relatives of the stolen generations. Many interviews of people as the Aborigines are gathering for a formal ceremony at Canberra at the Parliament. A filming of a formal, an absolutely touching formal ceremony of welcome by the Aborigines to the white settlers. A large log that's wrapped in some kind of fur, a woman in traditional dress walking up in a procession to the Prime Minister and offering a formal welcome by the natives of Australia to the new settlers. This is incredible nobility. And then when Kevin Rudd himself goes through the whole thing, he acknowledges, and acknowledgement is a critical part of the healing portion. You can't just say, all right, we're sorry for what we did. You have to lay out every crime, and maybe you can't do it in just a few hours, but enough symbolic representation of crimes committed that the victims know that you know what you did or what your people did. Psychologically, it's critical. And then he would lay out a number of crimes that the government of Australia had committed against the Aboriginal people, and then he would say, "For this we are sorry." And he must have repeated that phrase 10 or 12 times. And during that time, there are cameras panning the crowds, the Aborigines, inside the parliament, and people, because it was carried live throughout the country, and audiences sitting on the grass. You need a big box of Kleenex to watch this film, because there's a lot of crying going on. And that's what happens when people are released, when they finally sense that there is justice in the world. Because one of the great tragedies of a psychology of victimhood for people whose wounds have not been healed is that they've lost faith in the concept of justice, of existential justice. And here, a community was getting justice and contrition from the formal leader of the state, the prime minister, in a sense that they couldn't just sit calmly and listen to it. They cried. Old men, they're just gorgeous, big white beards, cowboy hats, very characteristic Aborigine noses, and their relatives just holding their hands, stroking their hands while they were listening. This wave of remorse and contrition was going on. So, there are we face many cynics and people who are conditioned to thinking that only force, the only thing these people understand is force. And so we defend ourselves that way. And they will, and they are unmoved. The good way to find really healthy people is to show them this film and see who's unmoved. And then you make sure you never make them vice president or secretary of defense. Because, face it, the human beings are capable of a great range of behaviors. But public opinion at large is very hungry for this to believe that healing is possible. So it's a rather long answer to your question, but it's a totally right-on question. As it's Tom's, it's how do you affect government? How do you affect the official diplomats? And I was frankly shocked to see that, because I live from hand to mouth, month to month, but before the campaign was over, I donated $1,750 to Obama's campaign in small increments. We have to be involved politically. We have to support political leaders in their election campaigns that reflect these values of a willingness to engage with the other, to respect the other, to respect the religion of the other, to see the human behind every face. That's what this is quite an insanely ambitious project, healing the family of Abraham. But I think we have the technology, and we just need the energy and the support.
And one that's definitely needed.
Yeah.
And I think that it needs to be given validation that this does too work,
Mhm.
possibly even better than the other way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Sir. Yes, ma'am.
This is simply a
Can you
community
stand up?
a community news item. In our area, there's a unity group composed of the churches in the area. And last Sunday, we had a unity walk
Mhm.
down Massachusetts Avenue, starting at the synagogue, stopping at the Catholic Church, if you wished, over to the Sikh, it's not a temple, is it?
There's a
Yes.
temple.
Is it a temple? Then down to the Vatican Embassy, to the Greek Church, St. Sophia's, then down to the where the Muslims.
The
uh,
Islamic Center.
Islamic
Mosque,
Center
the mosque.
on Mass Ave.
So there is hope that the
Yeah.
grounds work going on. I also want to say I'm reading James Carroll's Practicing Catholic,
Mhm.
and he goes through all the things that bother him, bother me, bother Catholics, but we're still Catholics.
Mhm.
I have one question. What happened to Hagar's son, Ishmael? Did he start another religion?
Well, he is the symbolic father of the Arab and by connection Muslim world. The Quran has a version of Genesis which doesn't track entirely with the Hebrew Bible version. It has Ishmael and Abraham founding, building the Kaaba in Mecca. But the more one studies the history of the Prophet, and there were Christians and Jews in Hijaz around the Prophet, and these monotheistic religions were in the air. So they had profound influence. And Jesus is a superstar in the Quran, and Moses is the most mentioned of the prophets. One of the sad ironies of particularly the Christian-Muslim relationship and how negative it is, because Christians, including Protestant Reformed Christians, but the Catholics too, I mean, starting with Urban II, just despised Islam and considered the Prophet an impostor, and how dare he form a new religion. And basically what Islam evolved was clearly an amalgamation. The revelation in Islam comes from the same God who sent the same book, one great book in heaven, the Hebrew Bible to the Jews, the Injil, the Gospels to the Christians, and finally, in God's attempt to finally get it right, the Quran to the Muslims. But in a sense, a definition of a Muslim is an active participle in Arabic. It means one who submits to the will of God. And so from the Muslim perspective, Abraham was a Muslim. Every monotheist is a Muslim. So and the irony is Islam is the most embracing of the three Abrahamic faiths. And one of the, certainly I know one of the goals of the Rumi Forum is to get that message across, to sort of decontaminate the historical relationship of hostility, to establish the authenticity of Islam as a faith tradition that's very much linked to Judaism and Christianity. And Islam also was embracing Sabaeans, Zoroastrians, Hindus. In fact, Aziz Sachedina, my beloved friend and colleague, whose book called Islam and the Challenge of Human Rights, which has just been published by Oxford, started out as a project called Islam and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's something I nominated him for the grant that he got so he could write this book from the Carnegie Corporation. It's there. It's all what the prophets want, and what the prophets conveyed from their revelation is really what we all want. And to give Islam the credit for being an embracing religion is really one of our biggest tasks.
Okay, last question. Thank you.
My name is Ranjit Chatterjee. I'm affiliated with the University of Maryland, and I'm somewhat of an amateur student of Jewish studies. I have practically no knowledge of Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino or any of those tongues, but I have done some work in English and other languages that I know. And I must say at the outset that I was most moved to hear your answer to Cynthia's question, in which you touched upon so much historical material and touched so many of the right buttons, going as far afield as Australia and the Aboriginal story, which is very parallel to our stories close at home to the Native Americans and slaves who suffered similar tortures and humiliations all through their existence and still do. And you also mentioned the fate of the Jews under the Romans and the Crusades, and perhaps we should include the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition before that. And so there's a long history of crime, as you pointed out, and it's almost as if we need a criminal investigation into history so that the criminals may atone to the satisfaction of the victims. And I am only very moved to see the role that you're playing here. And by being moved, I hope I qualify someday to be Vice President or Secretary of State, as you said. Just a joke. I just would like to shut up after making this one little remark, if I may, about people who take upon themselves the self-righteous knowledge of who they are, identity, and it breeds a certain arrogance of our ability to perform on the stage of history, the right that we have, superpowers and different religious dogmas and doctrines. The Greeks were very good at being ethnocentric. And it is, in fact, to my understanding, the Hebrew Torah that and the prophets that criticize these tendencies and speak up against the states and the powerful, and therefore they tend to get it in the neck more often than not. So in that connection, I had a beloved teacher at the University of Chicago, where I studied, who was a professor of Urdu. And he's now retired, but we used to converse about Muslims in India and Hindus and Muslims and Sufi Islam and how the Saudis might think of Sufi Islam and Iranian religion as opposed to Sunni religion and so on. And he said to me once, only God knows who's a Muslim. I don't know if he made this up or if it's something traditional. He said, if somebody says to you, I'm a Muslim, you have a right to be skeptical, because it says somewhere, he implied, only God knows who's a Muslim. And we can extend that to other religions, people who are too gung-ho about being Christians or Jews or whatever it may be. That God is in judgment over us, and only He knows. And if we all accept that, then the level of conflict may come down. Thank you.
Well, it's another rich question. It's absolutely true that the essence of Islam is that every individual is imbued with a conscience, an internal sense of right and wrong, and therefore is responsible for his or her behavior. And their future in the afterlife will be judged by God based on individual record, behavior on earth. So it's a very libertarian kind of discipline. And that's why the morality police are so offensive. But some societies are very, very traditional and very patriarchal and very restrictive. And they're cultural, so they've covered Islam they've interpreted Islam, they've hired their judges and teachers to interpret Islam in a very restrictive way. But people like Sajadina and others, intellectuals and progressives, many of whom come from the subcontinent, Indian Muslims, Pakistanis, and are trying to get across the true message of the Prophet and how embracing it is. Tom's painting of Ishmael has him embracing Ishmael and Hagar. His arms are out holding the family together. It's very inspired. I think it was inspired by higher power. But the thing is, in a sense, you can challenge anybody. If I say I'm a Christian, you can challenge what makes you a Christian. Because there's a certain presumptuousness of virtue in that statement. And for a Muslim to say the same thing, or a Jew or a Hindu, what goes into the relationship is not whether they are good or bad or fraudulent, but what kind of history is behind each identity, what kind of memory of injustice is behind that identity. And the healing history approach is critical to transforming the memory or healing the memory to something that is a manageable interfaith, interethnic relationship based on a newly acquired sense that justice is possible. And that's really what it's huge, but actually it's really quite simple in theory and practice. With small groups, it happens all the time. The challenge is to convey this new way of understanding history and human potential to large populations, to nations. It's a tremendous struggle in Israel now, which has many subdivisions of identity groups among the Jewish population. It's 1/5 Israeli Arab, Palestinians, and then Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The huge immigration of so-called Soviet Jews or Russian Jews added a whole new identity group to Israel, and there's a whole history to that. One of my projects, or one of my research projects, is trying to trace the origins of a very understandable embrace of violence by Jews in 19th century Russia as a response to Christian pogroms, the humiliation of villages of people being slaughtered. It's totally, it's unnatural not to be enraged by that. And so you had people like the poet laureate, in a sense, the famous poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, embracing vengeful violence, and Vladimir Jabotinsky developing a political doctrine of aggressive defense of the self. This is totally consistent with the project, scientific verified reaction of defense of the self. So that's why we have to take a history, and I'm glad you pointed that out. Investigation. This is what called forensic scholarship. We have to walk through the history, find out who committed the crimes, who's guilty, the cumulative guilt throughout history, and that becomes the agenda for healing. But it becomes the indictment and the agenda for acknowledgement. So there's a process, but as each crime is acknowledged, there are literally stressor hormones in our brains, and whole communities have elevated levels of stressor hormones when they feel they have to be on the defensive because their enemy might try to hurt them again. So the healing process is designed to literally lower the level of stressor hormones in the brain through processes of communication, acknowledgement, contrition, and forgiveness, if that's possible. I tend to underemphasize forgiveness because too many people of goodwill want to start with forgiveness before the hard work of acknowledgement and contrition is done, and I'm quite obsessive about that. Forgiveness is the ultimate goal, but you can't expect a victimized nation or people, after they've heard an apology, to simply hold a press conference and say we forgive. Forgiveness will be manifested in different ways of new levels of engagement and relationship. Forgiveness is our ultimate goal, but it's the end of the process, not the beginning. The hard work is acknowledgement of our own crimes, and that's not easy.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks for joining us today for this luncheon with Joseph Montville, and please visit Abrahamic Family Reunion. Yes.
.org.
.org, yes, but not it's just Abrahamic Family Reunion.
All one word.
All one word, .org. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.